Thank you, Representative Lee. We're here today to discuss an important, a very important, vulnerable part of our population, the exploitation of children through child sexual abuse material. That's what has now come to be known as CSAM, and we'll probably refer to it today as CSAM. CSAM is defined as pictures and videos that capture the sexual abuse of children below the age of 18. The term child pornography is still widely used by the public, but it is more accurate to call it what it is, evidence of child sexual abuse. It is the exploitation of children through CSAM materials remains a serious issue and is actually growing both in the United States and abroad. Reports of CSAM continue to grow, with 3,000 reports in 1998, growing to more than 1 million in 2014 and 18.4 million in 2019. The United States has a duty to protect our children from becoming victims of these despicable acts. Our subcommittee conducted a hearing on this subject in September, and we heard from many experts and survivor advocates in the field. Today, we are continuing that discussion by shining light on the heroic efforts of identifying, rescuing, and giving a voice to these countless victims. While it seems like this evil is something that happens in foreign countries or in someone else's neighborhood, it is actually much closer than we think. Identifying children depicted in CSAM is crucial to stop their ongoing victimization and capture the offenders producing it and rescuing the victims. The work cannot be done just by our federal government. Joint efforts among federal, state, international, and non-government partners are essential for the identification and rescue of victims. You'll hear more today about Operation Renewed Hope from our witnesses, but I'd like to briefly touch on what it is and its impact. Operation Renewed Hope ran from July through August 4th, 2023. The operation was the first of its kind in the United States, conjoining federal law enforcement agencies with non-government organizations to identify, locate, and rescue victims of child exploitation. I understand Operation Renewed Hope is ongoing, and I hope more victims continue to be rescued and provided with the care they need and deserve. Our committee continues with Homeland Security investigations to enhance our knowledge and understanding of investigations related to human trafficking and child exploitation. We appreciate the work being done to identify victims from government entities such as HSI and nonprofits such as NCMEC and the Tim Tebow Foundation. These groups are leading the charge to identify and rescue children, and for that we thank them. Sunshine is the best disinfectant, and it's the best way to rid the world of these predators who abuse and exploit children. We must bring attention to these innocent victims, these children who are living in the shadows, longing to be discovered and rescued. We must not shy away from hard topics and hard conversations. We have got to do better. This hearing is a continuation of efforts that we started last fall, and I look forward to doing more to protect children in the United States and abroad. And with that, I yield back, and I now recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, for her opening statement.
I thank the chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing, Chairman Biggs, and I thank the ranking member who could not be here, Sheila Jackson-Lee, because of her important work in this space. I thank her for asking me to sit in the chair in her absence. This hearing today on the identification of victims of child sexual abuse materials or videos or photos. I'm here as a legislator, as a member of Congress, but you might imagine I'm really here more importantly as a mother and a grandmother to 4 grandchildren. While the presence of child sexual abuse images and videos online is not new, it's not a new issue for this committee, the current scale and scope and complexity of the problem has now reached epidemic status globally, requiring a search for new solutions. The market for CSAM, child sexual abuse materials, sometimes I worry CSAM could be some other agency, but we have to say what it is. Child sexual abuse materials far exceeds existing resources necessary to bring purveyors and consumers of the images to justice. Moreover, we have yet to fully address the quantum of resources and the manpower necessary to identify and rescue child victims of these heinous crimes. The internet and digital devices have become the tools of the trade for child predators, including those who produce, process, and distribute child sexual abuse material, or groom, extort, or coerce children to produce images and videos themselves. Perpetrators of this repulsive set of crimes frequently operate with impunity, recording the commission of unthinkable acts on their young victims and trading the images for sport, often knowing that their identities and locations are cloaked behind a wall of encryption. Identifying all victims seen in child sexual abuse materials is of the utmost importance. Behind these images, videos, and live streams are children who may still be the victim of continuing abuse and suffering, hoping to be found, hoping to be rescued. While Congress certainly has the authority to enact more federal legislation, victims and survivors need help today. That is why we must fully support the various federal initiatives and partnerships already in place to help identify, locate, and rescue victims. In other words, if members of this body truly care about the safety of our children, truly care about CSAM victims and the need to prevent the victimization of more children, we will provide the necessary resources, the funding to law enforcement and to nonprofits who are in this critical space. We have to support prosecutorial offices, everybody who is on the front line, and there are so many of you, and I'm thanking you for being here today. For example, the Internet Crimes Against Children, ICAC, task forces have become essential to investigating crimes committed against children on the Internet and identifying victims. Although this program enlists the service of more than 5,400 law enforcement agencies and prosecutors' offices, task force members are often stretched to a breaking point due to resource shortages. Task force members face the arduous task of reviewing thousands of images a year, searching not only for some clue about the identity of the child depicted in the image or their location, but also for the location of thousands of IP addresses that uploaded, downloaded, or shared the images online. At the same time, task force members must sift through thousands of tips received through the cyber tip line at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and determine which tips are actionable. It seems clear that we must evolve our focus to stress more on the victim-centered prosecution. Although that will require dedicated additional resources, law enforcement should not have to choose between rescuing children and finding criminals. As I said, as a member of Congress, as a grandmother, I thank each of you witnesses for being here today, and I thank you for the work you do. It must take an extraordinary toll on you. We have all a responsibility to all of our children and to eradicate every form of child exploitation. I hope that through your experiences and advocacy and work, today's conversation will lead to victim-centered solutions. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The lady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from the ranking member from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by saying that Subcommittee Ranking Member Sheila Jackson-Lee sends her regrets. She was delayed as a result of her own primary yesterday on Super Tuesday, but is on a flight to D.C. as we speak. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing and for shining a light on efforts to combat the sexual exploitation of children. Law enforcement experts and victims advocates have reported that advancements in technology have led to an explosion of child sex abuse material, known as CSAM, available and distributed online. Horrific photographs and videos depicting depraved acts against children are now increasingly readily available through virtually every internet-based technology, including social networking platforms, file-sharing sites, gaming devices, and mobile apps. A demand for new and more egregious images and videos drives the market for this material, resulting in the continued abuse and exploitation of children. Since the sexual violence depicted in these images and videos is a record of the victimization and suffering of a child, it is important that law enforcement make the identification of victims of child sexual abuse material a priority. To that end, Congress must provide sufficient resources and funding to those agencies and organizations charged with identifying, locating, and rescuing these children. The importance of victim identification is multifaceted. To begin with, because child sexual abuse material is tangible evidence of sexual abuse crime, victim identification enables the rescue of a victimized child. Not only are victims removed from harmful environments, but following removal, they can be connected to the services, support, and care they need to heal and rebuild their lives. Victim identification also facilitates justice for victims. tracing digital footprints back to producers and distributors of the images, as well as perpetrators of the abuse, ensuring that they are prosecuted and held accountable for their crimes. Federal law enforcement agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, combat CSAM cases through targeted enforcement actions, investigative initiatives, and victim assistance programs. While these agencies work tirelessly in their investigations to track down perpetrators involved in the production and distribution of this material, they are also committed to identifying and locating victims. However, despite their best efforts, federal law enforcement agencies cannot tackle this problem alone. The collaborative efforts of federal, local, and state law enforcement agencies, along with private and nonprofit organizations, supported by federal funding and grant programs, are instrumental in identifying and rescuing victims of child sexual abuse material, as well as bringing offenders to justice and providing essential support to victims of sexual exploitation. The 61 Coordinated Internet Crimes Against Children, or ICAC, task forces across the country have been crucial to preventing, investigating, prosecuting, and developing effective responses to Internet crimes against children. Through their comprehensive efforts, the ICAC task forces, which represent over 5,400 local, state, and federal law enforcement and prosecutorial agencies, are making significant strides in identifying and rescuing victims of child sex abuse material. But the growth of the problem continues to outpace the resources available to identify and locate victims, while law enforcement, prosecutors, the tech industry, and other organizations must continually contend with the emergence of new technologies like artificial intelligence, which further complicates their efforts. Today, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, reports that the cyber tip line has received more than 92 million reports. Its child victim identification program has reviewed over 331 million images and videos, reviewing more than 25 million images annually. And while most of the children reflected in the images remain unknown, over 19,300 victims have been identified. We should certainly commend the successes of NCMEC and other law enforcement agencies in identifying and rescuing victims, but we cannot be satisfied while so many CSAM victims remain unidentified. I hope that our discussion today will focus primarily on what Congress can do to help identify more victims, with the goal of reaching all of them. During a hearing last September, which examined the threat of child exploitation in the U.S. and abroad, we heard about the various struggles of law enforcement when confronting the edict of do more with less. When considering the plight of CSAM victims, this maxim is clearly unacceptable. The collaboration between local, state, and federal law enforcement and non-governmental entities is fundamental to addressing the complex challenges posed by investigating child sexual abuse material and identifying victims. It is our duty to fully support each of these entities and to ensure that they have the resources they need to accomplish their various missions, which undoubtedly should be centered around victim identification. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I thank everyone for their opening statements, and without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I'm going to now introduce today's witnesses, and I appreciate each of you for being here today, taking time out to come talk about this important topic. Mr. Tim Tebow. Mr. Tebow is a renowned former collegiate and professional football quarterback, having received awards such as the Heisman Trophy and being a 2023 inductee to the College Football Hall of Fame. His foundation, the Tim Tebow Foundation, works to bring faith, hope, and love to those needing a brighter day in their darkest hour of need. In addition to other efforts, his foundation works with DHS HSI's Cybercrime Center on Operation Renewed Hope to identify previously unidentified victims of child sexual exploitation and rescue the children if possible. Thank you for being here today, Mr. Tebow. Mr. Jim Cole. Mr. Cole is the Chief of Law Enforcement Enterprise and Technology at Operation Lightshine, an organization that works to combat child exploitation and human trafficking. He's a former supervisory special agent with DHS HSI and served previously as the chair of the Interpol Specialist Group on Crimes Against Children. He also served as the chair of the Victim Identification Subgroup from 2016 through 2019. Thank you for being here with us, Mr. Cole. Mr. John Madsen is the board president of Raven, a nonprofit organization that works to prevent child exploitation. He also serves as the Chief Operating Officer of Griffi, Inc., a software company focused on visual media analysis to support victim identification and other law enforcement activities. He was previously a detective with the Gainesville Police Department, served 10 years at the North Florida ICAC as Task Force Commander, and served as the chair of the ICAC Emerging Technologies Working Group. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Madsen. Ms. Camille Cooper. Ms. Cooper serves as Vice President of Anti-Human Trafficking and Child Exploitation at the Tim Tebow Foundation. She has worked for over 20 years on issues including child protection, child exploitation, and child trafficking. She previously served for 13 years as the Director of Government Affairs at the National Association to Protect Children, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting children from abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Ms. Cooper, thank you for being here today. Everyone, we're glad to have all the folks in the gallery as well, and we appreciate you being here for this important hearing. We're going to begin now by swearing in our witnesses. If each of you would please rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have each answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. If you get to 5 minutes, you'll probably start hearing this. And that's what you want to hear rather than a big, massive gavel. So just so you know. But that'll be kind of that'll be a cue for you to wrap up as soon as possible after that. We're going to begin now with Mr. Tebow. Please, your 5 minutes.
Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member Nadler, Ms. Dean, honorable members of the committee, thank you guys so much for having me. Camille, Jim, John, so grateful for you guys and so honored to be here with you and humbled to be beside you. My name is Tim Tebow, and as Chairman Biggs stated, I was fortunate to be and humbled to be the chairman and the founder of the Tim Tebow Foundation, and we exist to bring faith, hope, and love to those needing a brighter day in their darkest hour of need. To sum it up, we strive to fight for people that can't fight for themselves. Some of you may know me from sports, but honestly, more of you probably know me from getting cut from a bunch of sports teams, as Ms. Dean mentioned earlier, so thanks, Ms. Dean. We can talk about that later, it's all good. But honestly, why we're here today is to talk about the MVP. Not the MVP I chased most of my life. Couldn't get, by the way, but chased. Not the MVP most of you are probably thinking, no, not the most valuable player. A more important MVP, the most vulnerable people. That's why we're here today. A year and a half ago, this awesome lady to my left, Camille Cooper, joined our team, and I asked Camille, I said, Camille, what breaks your heart the most? And she wrote down the number 20,000. And I said, what does that mean? And she said, it's a problem. I said, what problem is that? It's the 20,000 boys and girls that have been abused and raped. And their images and videos have been captured, but nobody has been able to identify them. They're unknown. Until someone knows them, how could somebody rescue them? And I knew that day that my heart was broken and my eyes were open, and we had to do something. So I said, Camille, what do you think's the best approach? And she said, bring the best teams and players together. So we convened a meeting in Lyon, France, with amazing frontline heroes. Homeland Security, Interpol, Europol, NCMEC, ICMEC, ONIMI, Google, so many people and many more came to the table with really two goals. The first one, how many boys and girls are unknown, are unidentified? And it wasn't 20,000. It was over 50,000. And the second goal is how do we protect them? And that's where Operation Renewed Hope was born, led by HSI just a few miles away from here. And so many partners from around the world. And in 15 days, they were able to identify 316 boys and girls. 316 boys and girls. It was an incredible operation, but that's a tiny dent. and what we're called to get to. It was amazing work, but it was so small in comparison. And so why we're here today is to be able to ask you to say yes to a bill that we're going to present. And this bill really has one goal: to build a rescue team. Because there's so many frontline warriors and heroes, but there's just not enough. And we need to support them, and we need more of them to get to these 50,000 boys and girls. So this bill is strictly to create a rescue team that has the funding, the support, the training, the technology, so that they can get to these 50,000. You know, I've had the privilege of playing for a lot of sports teams in my life. And almost all of them, we've had incredible resources to give us a better chance at winning a game, something that ultimately, as much as we care about it, doesn't matter. Why would we not give as much, if not more, resources to the frontline heroes that are going after the most vulnerable boys and girls on the planet? You see, when Operation Renewed Hope identified that 316, and out of all those that were rescued, more than half of them were right here in the U.S. And when you extrapolate those numbers, that means that there's thousands of boys and girls that are starving for hope in our backyard. And we have the chance to bring hope to those that are starving for it, if we're willing. But honestly, my words will probably fall flat today. So instead of hearing from me, I would rather you hear from one of my heroes, a young girl who went through extreme abuse for 7 years. And almost every night she got raped for 7 years. And in the middle of her abuse, this is what she writes. Rescue me. Help me. Monsters are chasing. Can't you see? Monsters are whispering. Can't you hear? Monsters are shouting. You're nothing. Can't you feel my pain? Monsters are pushing. End it all. Just jump. Can't you hear all the whys I'm asking? Monsters are laughing. You're all alone in this. Can someone please rescue me? This girl and thousands of boys and girls just like her, they're calling out to you and to me. And how many times in my life have I missed the call? Have I missed the mark? Unfortunately, too many. But would today be a day that we wouldn't miss the mark, that we would hear her cries, that we would hear her call, and we would answer the call? Because every single one of those boys and girls is worth us answering the call and doing everything we can so that they can experience the faith, hope, and love that they deserve. Not the bondage and torture that they're in right now. I believe if we build that rescue team, we will have a chance of getting to every one of those boys and girls. I got a message last night from a girl who has been rescued, and she said, "Thank you so much for speaking up for us." And it was humbling to get that. But if all we do today is speak, if all I do is speak, I also miss the mark. We have to do more than just talk about it. We have to act on it and be about it. Thank you for having me, and God bless.
Thank you, Mr. Tebow. Mr. Cole, you are now recognized for your 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Biggs, Ms. Dean, and honorable members of the committee. My name is Jim Cole, and I appear before you today as a retired supervisory special agent with Homeland Security Investigations, Chair Emeritus of the Interpol Specialist Group on Crimes Against Children, founding partner of ONIMI Global Solutions, and the Chief of Law Enforcement Enterprise and Technology at Operation Lightshine, a nonprofit organization that raises funds for law enforcement agencies so they can dedicate resources to protecting our children. I extend my gratitude for Tim's passionate opening today and his unwavering commitment to these issues. As I've gotten to know Tim over the past few years, I've seen firsthand that Tim is the real deal. He puts his money where his mouth is, both literally and figuratively. I spent my 20-year career at HSI on the forefront of combating child sexual exploitation, an endeavor that has become my life's mission. I've had the opportunity to conduct several career cases, one that changed my life and career forever. That case inspired a new approach focused on victim rescue rather than solely arresting child sexual abuse material distributors. This methodology emphasizes uncovering new material and focusing on innocuous clues hidden within the vast arrays of seized multimedia content, shifting the priority to finding and safeguarding victims instead of just putting offenders in jail. I was recruited to establish HSI's victim identification program and laboratory at the HSI Cybercrime Center. Some of you and your staff recently visited that very lab and saw firsthand the incredible work that goes on in it. It is one of my proudest legacies. One notable case that garnered national media attention was Operation Sunflower. After several images depicting the exploitation of a young girl were shared on a darknet child exploitation site and found by a Danish victim identification specialist overseas, we began an urgent effort to identify and safeguard her. One of the images depicted the young victim in the backseat of a car with a blurry highway sign out through the window. This sign, we determined, was in Kansas, starting with a 2 and running east and west. Around hay bale, a hedgerow, and a tree near the sign made it unique. With this information, we set out across Kansas, driving down every highway, starting with a 2 and running east and west, looking for that sign. On the second day of the search, I just happened to be with the agent from Kansas City. We drove down Highway 20, and we found that sign. It came into focus as we neared the highway's end, and as we got closer, I could see the hay bale, the hedgerow, the tree. This discovery expedited the 11-year-old victim's identification and rescue from ongoing abuse that very day. From the discovery of the CSAM on the darknet to the child's rescue, only 13 days had elapsed. During my 7 years running the program and lab, I had 4 personnel conducting victim identification. It's not near enough. As Tim stated earlier, there are tens of thousands of unsolved series, unidentified victims out there who are waiting on us to safeguard them. There's already an incredible and successful blueprint to increase victim identification personnel within HSI and support our nation's military veterans at the same time. We need to look no further than the HSI Hero program to see the path forward. I've submitted a document laying out a viable strategy for consideration. Victim identification requires global collaboration. Every case I worked in my 20 years had a global nexus. Offenders do not care about lines on a map. The horrific rape of a 3-year-old girl is memorialized on video by her own father, and in minutes is available on a darknet child exploitation site with over 1 million members. In under an hour, that child's worst moments are downloaded by thousands of offenders around the globe. In 24 hours, that number is tens of thousands. Interpol plays a vital role in victim identification to the International Child Sexual Exploitation Database. The platform brings together victim identification experts from over 68 countries in a secure, collaborative portal, enabling real-time collaborative analysis of unidentified CSAM. This global collaboration is crucial for swiftly identifying and rescuing victims. However, the system is old and requires updates to enhance its effectiveness. Shortly, you'll hear from my colleague and friend John Madsen, who will address resource constraints in combating child exploitation. I'd like to briefly contribute to this topic. After retiring from HSI in March, I joined Operation Lightshine, a nonprofit working with Tim and TTF at OLS. We empower law enforcement with necessary funds, resources, technology, and training to fight CSAM and human trafficking via our Intercept task forces. We secure private funding to equip local and state agencies with essentials like detective salaries, vehicles, forensic tools, and the resources they desperately need but lack funding for. The mission of OLS underscores the glaring shortfall in federal support for this crucial battle. OLS should not have to exist. The proposed funding for the creation of victim identification specialist positions with HSI represents a critical investment in the nation's efforts to combat child sexual exploitation. By leveraging the skills and dedication of our veterans and equipping them with the tools and training they need, Congress can significantly enhance our ability to protect children from exploitation and abuse. We urge Congress to support this vital initiative, which will only aid in the fight against child sexual exploitation, but also provide meaningful career opportunities to those who have served our country. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Appreciate your testimony. Mr. Madsen, you are now recognized for your 5 minutes.
Chairman Biggs, Ms. Dean, and distinguished members of Congress, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on a Voice for the Voiceless, CSAM identification. Having dedicated the majority of my career to investigating crimes against children, it is truly an honor to be here today and to advocate for resources for the men and women in law enforcement who are still on the front lines. That is the very purpose for which Raven was created, through the collective experience of its members, to educate and advocate at the highest levels of government for the resources necessary for our Internet Crimes Against Children task forces, to give attention to those who are not heard and to a voice to those who cannot speak. Raven's mission statement is to transform the nation's response to child exploitation, and today it is my hope that the opportunity to increase law enforcement's response is seized. The Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force is a nationwide DOJ program that has supported state and local agencies with funding, training, and investigative tools since 1998. The ICAC program is authorized through the Protect Our Children Reauthorization Act and remains an impactful force in the fight against child exploitation. The ICAC Task Force program successfully unifies the jurisdictions of nearly 5,500 agencies and 11,600 investigators, examiners, prosecutors, and educators covering the entire United States. As a detective with the Gainesville, Florida Police Department, I had the privilege of being part of the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force for 12 years as an investigator, forensic examiner, and for the last 10 years as the task force commander. Through that capacity, I was privileged to have the opportunity to co-create a statewide annual training conference, plan and execute nearly 50 multi-agency undercover operations, 8 CSAM categorization operations, 2 victim ID operations, in partnership with Homeland Security, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and Interpol, and implement a multi-year effort to adopt an overall victim-centric approach in CSAM investigations through training and funding support. Victim identification is central to all investigations, and for most cases where a child has a connection to the offender, that relationship and identity is discovered within that investigation. The problem arises when CSAM images and videos are shared between offenders who did not create them and had no connection to the victim depicted. In those situations, the government becomes the listed victim, and for reasons such as backlog and staffing issues, it is often that no further effort is taken to identify the children in the pictures except for a submission to the National Center. Outside of individual state and local agencies, Homeland Security and FBI both maintain victim identification units and support requests for victim ID assistance. Since 2002, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has acted as the national clearinghouse, maintaining a database of known and unknown exploited children, with over 100 analysts assigned to identifying victims at different stages of media review. The Child Victim Identification Program is a critical piece of the U.S. domestic effort, maintaining a repository of the most horrific images and videos beyond what you can imagine. Through the ICAC investigative and operational standards, all ICAC task forces and affiliates are required to submit their CSAM files to NCMEC's Child Victim Identification Program. This, in turn, allows NCMEC CVIP analysts to continuously compare incoming information against unsolved cases in a central location. Unfortunately, the process is cumbersome and dated. That is why I ask that you support the Report Act and COSMA so that the necessary authority can be given to allow for online and immediate submission of CSAM material for review and action. An equally important group are the victims we know exist yet unable to discover without additional funding to support long-term staffing and support. Already in 2024, ICAC investigative tools have observed over 85,000 unique IP addresses in the United States associated with users offering to share known child sexual abuse material. But only 367 of those cases have been claimed as under investigation. A single torrent or file group readily available for download contains thousands of images and hundreds of videos of toddlers being raped. At a minimum, these offenders use known CSAM for inspiration, normalization, and grooming. I ask that you endorse the Protect Our Children Reauthorization Act and fund the MEC budget at $160 million with fenced-off language to ensure that both ICAC and NCMEC get their full authorized amounts. If you ask why, additionally, to fund this effort, a former task force commander from Arizona once phrased his motivation like this. After being asked why he would focus on child crimes when he could earn the same or more in a different bureau, he answered, because they believe in Santa Claus. To continue, I would ask, are we really numb to this horror to where these are just numbers to us? Are we really unwilling to rescue those who live in it? Is that the America I enlisted to serve, and are those the ideals we swore to uphold? In this world, there are causes worth fighting for, regardless of the pain, worth sacrificing for, regardless of the risk. There are moments that define us as people and society, and this is one. Please fund the ICAC task forces. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Manson, for your testimony. Now, I recognize Ms. Cooper for her 5 minutes. Can you press the microphone button there, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Dean, Ranking Member Nadler, and honorable members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to speak today. My name is Camille Cooper. I'm Vice President of Anti-Human Trafficking and Child Exploitation at the Tim Tebow Foundation. You've heard about the MVPs today. You've heard Tim talk about how important these unidentified children are. You've heard Jim talk about how important HSI and Interpol are. And you've heard John talk about how important the ICACs are. But today I want to talk about how important you are. In 2008, my former boss, Greer Weeks, and Flint Waters sat at this very table before this same subcommittee, and they showed you a map filled with red dots. Those dots represented 500,000 offenders sharing images of infants and toddlers being raped and tortured. They explained to the world that if left unchecked, this illicit market demand for the rape of children would result in new victims. They asked you to establish and support the ICAC task forces, and you did. There are now 61 ICAC task forces in every single one of your districts, and they've arrested over 134,000 child exploitation offenders. And according to the research of Dr. Michael Burke, we know now that 85% of those offenders also have real victims. They're actually contact offenders. As investigations increased, so did forensic demands, and this created a backlog that in some agencies was 2 years long. In 2009, Somer Thompson was abducted on her way home from school, and she was raped and murdered. Her little lifeless body was dumped in a landfill. But her death was preventable because her murderer's laptop sat on an evidence shelf for 2 months, and on the desktop of his laptop was a file called toddler insertion, and it was the rape of a 3-year-old girl. At that time, that acted as a catalyst for Homeland Security and Special Operations Command and the organization that I was previously with, Protect, and we created a solution with all of you here in this committee called the Hero Child Rescue Corps. It was this committee and the members of this committee that wrote both HERO Acts. Tens of thousands of children have been rescued as a result of that, so we thank you. This brings me to why we are here today. Just as we predicted in 2008, as investigations increased, images that had never been seen before also increased at an alarming rate. It's important for you to know how this happened so that you can appreciate the importance of why we're here. I'm going to take you upstream, past the distribution of the images, to the source of the actual abuse. For decades before the internet, the only way to know if a child was being sexually abused was if that child actually disclosed. Reports of sexual abuse in the United States have 2 tracks. If you are raped by your neighbor, your case goes to law enforcement. If you are raped by a parent or a caretaker, your case goes to social services, and you get a social worker instead of a cop. This is a diversion program for child rapists, and it was established in federal law in 1974 under the Child Abuse Prevention Act, under the Social Security Act. For child sex abusers, this law acted as an incentive to grow your own victims so that you wouldn't go to jail. Thanks to the dedicated work of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, we now, for the first time, have a glimpse of who's actually producing these images. And the most startling finding in their research was that most of the images are being produced by fathers, family members, and child offenders within the child's circle of trust. You can see from this, one of the charts over here, that chart over there, is that these offenders are people in your communities. These are your neighbors. These are people you work with. Maybe you play golf with them. This is your daughter's best friend's father that you send your daughter over to their house for a sleepover. These are the offenders we're talking about. And that is why victim identification is so critical, because these offenders have come out into the light of day for the first time in history. We don't have to rely on children's outcries. We can follow the digital trail of evidence right to the child's doorstep, and we can rescue them. Congress has recently held a lot of hearings around tech accountability, and that's incredibly necessary and important, but I would be remiss if I missed the opportunity today to highlight one company that is doing this well. It's Google. They have a dedicated victim identification team within their company, and they are literally rescuing thousands of children, and they need to be a model for how tech companies in this country do this work. You've heard Jim and Tim talk a lot about Interpol, and you're probably wondering why we're asking you to support a database in France. The Interpol ICSA database is the most important database because not all U.S. victims' abuse images are going to be found on U.S. offenders' computers. The father that rapes their child in Ohio is going to send that image to someone in Germany or Brazil or Italy, and it's the work of those international law enforcement agencies when they catch that offender and do the forensics on their computer, that they're going to find American victims, and all those new victims' images from countries around the world go to Interpol. They have a world-class training program, and they have the best analysts in the world, but they simply don't have enough of them. They've been overrun, and they need our support. Homeland Security Investigations is the most well-positioned law enforcement agency to support the work of Interpol's ICSA team. They are the tip of the spear in the world when it comes to child exploitation investigations. But we're talking about finding 50,000 children. It's a city of children that we need to go find. And they're fighting with a platoon. They need a brigade. We have 3 important requests for you today. 1, as Tim said, we need to build a rescue team. We need dedicated, specially trained victim identification analysts, and we need hundreds of them. We need to invest in their training, and we need to give them the absolute best tools that we have to go rescue these kids. And we need to modernize the ICSA database so that as these images pour in, they can keep up with it. A lot of people told me not to come up here and ask for your help because it's a presidential year. It's too partisan. We won't get anything done. But I've been up here with you before, and we've done great things together during presidential years. So I would just ask that everyone put their partisan differences aside in the pursuit of saving lives. These children need all of us to fight for them on one team, one mission. Let's go rescue these kids.
Thank you for your opening statement. Now it's time for member questions, and I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you for holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman. And I'm intrigued by this concept of a rescue team. And it seems like HSI, Homeland Security, is the preferred partner there. And I want to delve into why, because in this Congress, we had an FBI agent sitting right where you're all sitting right now, Steve Friend, and he was working these cases in our beloved Florida. And he was pulled off of those cases to go and take down people's license plates at school board meetings over parents protesting. And so I guess I want to understand best how to assemble the type of rescue team that you're talking about, and then maybe thinking about some of the assets that exist, like at the FBI, in addition to those at Homeland Security. So, perhaps Mr. Cole, Mr. Mattson, your law enforcement experience, you could draw on that and talk about how to assemble the right equities and the right capabilities to attack the problem.
Yes, Mr. Gates. So Homeland Security Investigations, surprisingly to most people, actually is responsible for more than 60% of child exploitation prosecutions, federal prosecutions in the United States. Traditionally, HSI is actually one of the first agencies to work this crime type. So prior to the internet, this material was smuggled into the country from foreign sources through our ports of entry and through the mails. U.S. Customs Service, which is the predicate agency for Homeland Security investigations, worked those investigations by seizing those materials as they came into the country across our borders. That gives us a legacy and long-term subject matter expertise in this crime type. And so we work closely with the U.S. Postal Service in that endeavor, and really the FBI didn't start working these cases until much later.
Yeah, but we're in a different era now. As Ms. Cooper's laid out, we've got to follow that digital footprint right back to the source so that we can make these rescues. And I guess I'm a little worried about Homeland Security because I'm holding this Inspector General report that analyzed how they're dealing with the number of unaccompanied children that are coming over the border. And I mean, in 16% of these cases, Homeland Security isn't even doing the documentation for where they're placing children. And we have over 8,000 children that we don't even know where to put them, that are in the custody of Homeland Security now. Mr. Mattson, do you have a perspective on maybe how to pull together the right equities to build the type of rescue team that we're discussing?
Thank you, Mr. Gates. As the former task force commander for North Florida, we worked very well with a lot of peer agencies within all the way from the Panhandle down to Rockledge, which was the area that I covered, both from federal and state and local, so between FDLE, FBI, and HSI. And we felt that was the appropriate way to collaborate and to work on these types of cases with the ability to prosecute federally when needed, or at the state level when needed.
And I just think we can, as the subcommittee with oversight over a lot of these equities that they're trying to pull together, we can give them the right encouragement and the right authority to do that. I've also been reviewing this Stanford Internet Observatory report on identifying and eliminating CSAM in generative machine learning training data and models. And I'm sort of interested in how AI interfaces with all this, because the report seems to say it's really troubling when you have these child exploitative materials that are part of the training models for AI, but the report goes on to say maybe it's AI that will help us do what Ms. Cooper is charging us to do and get to the core of the problem. And so, to any of you here, how do you see AI interfacing with both the perpetration of these crimes, but also perhaps the investigations and the prosecutions and the resolutions of them?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that answer. A couple things are really important to understand about AI. You have AI for good, right? So you have some tools that have been developed that are changing the game in terms of being able to find and locate these kids. And it's really important that we allow law enforcement to use those tools. But AI can be used for bad, too. So you have some nefarious people on the web that are taking pictures of your child's Instagram account, your child's face, and they're adding nudity and unclothing those children and then extorting those children. So the times have changed where a child doesn't even need to be taking selfies anymore. They can just have a soccer page or a gymnastics page up, and you have these pedophiles, trolling them and extorting them. The one thing I think that's really important, I think Congress has a role to play in this. There are ways to determine between a fake image and a real image, and that technology needs to improve. It needs to be invested in. There are watermarks that need to be required by Congress, so any company that is developing an AI tool needs to have a type of watermark so that law enforcement, as they're reviewing these images, can really distinguish between the fake and the real.
I'd love to follow up with you on that. Mr. Chairman, I have a couple unanimous consent requests. I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record the OIG Inspector General's report on some of these unaccompanied children at the border.
Without objection.
And I further seek unanimous consent to enter the Stanford Internet Observatory publication into the record as well.
Without objection.
And just, Mr. Tebow, last time I saw you in person, you were beating my Knowles in Tallahassee. So while I know this is a very challenging dynamic, it's good to see you again in person. Go Knowles.
Good to see you as well. I can't repeat the last part, but I guess, sorry, I'm not sorry. I don't know.
Gentleman's time's expired. I now recognize the ranking member of the whole committee, Mr. Nadler, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Madsen, you were once the commander of the North Florida Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. What type of cases did your unit investigate, and what percentage of your cases were related to the identification of child sexual abuse material victims?
So the type of cases that we dealt with was anything that had child exploitation and the internet related originally. But computer forensics, proactive file sharing investigations, also undercover chat type investigations. People may be familiar with the show To Catch a Predator, similar to that type of setup. We did a lot of those investigations, a couple of human trafficking operations as well.
And how many law enforcement officers were under your command, and how many officers were dedicated to the identification of victims depicted in child sexual abuse material?
So the task force covered about 220 so investigators that were connected to the task force at some varying levels of FTE or hours per week. There was a distribution between there of prosecutors and examiners and investigators. Specifically for victim identification, victim ID is sort of a subset of regular investigations. You do what you can as you're investigating a crime, certainly if you have to, if there is a physical victim involved in it. But I would say that we had no people at the time solely dedicated to identifying victims within images or movies that weren't related to the active case that we're
No people solely dedicated?
Not solely, no, sir.
Okay. Do you believe that your task force had the resources and funding it needed to carry out its mission, particularly in identifying child sexual abuse material victims?
I believe that we could do a lot more with more resources and more funding. We had the funding we had, and we made do with what we had. And in terms of buying equipment for people, we got the best prices we could to be able to afford as much rollout as possible.
In a perfect world, how much bigger a budget would you want?
For the entire ICAC program or for the MEC budget?
What you do, yeah.
So a calculation was done by another Raven member that put it around $500 million per year.
Compared to what now?
Right now, I think ICACs are authorized at around 60. I believe that we get, the ICACs get about 32, 34 million.
You get about 32, 34, and you could use 500.
That would be to include actual staffing year over year. The problem with grant funding is if it's not certain that you will get it year over year, agencies are hesitant to hire people on its basis.
I see. Why is it important to dedicate investigative resources to identifying the victims depicted in child sexual abuse material?
I believe it's the reason we do the job to begin with.
And what can Congress do to help law enforcement identify victims depicted in child sexual abuse material more often and more effectively, and beyond giving you a bigger budget?
I think the two keys is the ability to conduct more investigations at the front lines. And the second piece is the international and national cooperation.
Well, the first piece means a bigger budget. Does it mean anything else?
Yes, sir. The collaborative effort, like the technology that underlies the way we communicate with the National Center CVIP program, the speed at which we can deliver information and the richness of that information, metadata, files, that sort of thing. And then also the international component that has been mentioned by the other witnesses.
And what harms are created when law enforcement focuses solely on prosecuting offenders rather than identifying victims? What are the benefits of shifting to a focus on victims when it comes to combating child sexual abuse material?
Well, for one, I believe it is our obligation. Certainly the benefit is that we're able to extract that victim from the ongoing abuse that they might be experiencing. But additionally, I believe it is our obligation and the primary reason we do the investigation. And certainly, when you're dealing with file sharing investigations, it's easy to be what we call suspect-centric, because the suspect may not have a relationship with that victim depicted. They're merely sharing and distributing media back and forth between offenders. So it's easy to make that arrest sort of end at that point. But what we are all asking for is there be additional effort and funding given to the ability to follow up on those images. For one, ensure that we can extricate the victims from the ongoing abuse, but also in an organized manner to where every investigator who may identify them later on doesn't re-victimize them with another visit, so that we have a domestic center repository that can track and maintain those identities.
Thank you. And finally,
gentleman's time has expired. But I'm going to let you ask that last question, Mr.
What operational changes or resources might be needed to shift from an offender-focused model to a victim-focused model of combating the spread of child sexual abuse material?
Well, to spend the extra time it takes to liaise with other entities, whether at Homeland, FBI, the National Center, or Interpol, it takes additional time. And as you brought up earlier, the lack of specifically dedicated victim identification specialists make it harder for the regular investigator to take time out to do that. When you have a significant backlog, you have other cases coming in, and you have cyber tip increases that are quite high year over year.
Thank you, Mr. Mattson, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Absolutely.
I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you all for tackling this problem. And first of all, I'd like to ask Mr. Cole, am I hearing correctly that this problem is growing exponentially, or it has over the last decade or two? Is that accurate?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
In regards to, I believe it was Ms. Cooper that cited Google as really making some efforts to get after this. Why has Snapchat become so prevalent in the spread of CSAM?
Because Snapchat's a platform that's very popular with children. And so any platform where children will congregate, offenders will also congregate.
Ms. Cooper, so this is growing, and we're trying to get to the enforcement end of this, correct? Is there something missing in society that we're not getting to the root of this problem? What is driving this? Are there other efforts that you... So I want to thank you for what you're doing here and the efforts that you're putting forward, but is there a root problem here that we really need to get after also?
I'll answer that briefly and then hand it over to Timmy. I think that there's some recent research that was done by one of the largest medical journals, and there's a myth that people think that if you are sexually abused as a child, particularly as a boy, that you're going to grow up and become an offender, right? And that's actually not true. Boys that are survivors of this are probably less likely to become offenders than the general population. But there's one study that was a longitudinal study. It was actually studied over, I think, 60 years. And what they found was that the increased risk is actually physical violence against boys. So boys that are beaten up in childhood tend to have a much higher risk of sexual offending. But I'm going to go ahead and let Timmy answer the rest.
Well, if I could, I just want to touch on what was just mentioned and why Homeland is so important to this. So for those 50,000 boys and girls, when they're doing an investigation, they have no idea where that is. They have no idea if that is in Jacksonville, Florida, if it's in Minneapolis, if it's in Chile. And so why Homeland Security working with Interpol is so important is because of all the SAC offices and the 93 attaché offices and the Interpol working in 68 countries and so many countries working together is wherever that leads, they have the opportunity to then act on the other end. And if not, then the boundaries and jurisdiction stop you from being able to follow where that lead is. And that's one of the reasons why Operation Renewed Hope is so successful, is because they have so many people from all over working together to wherever that leads. They have the opportunity to be able to rescue a boy and girl and maybe put a bad guy away.
Mr. Cole or Mr. Madsen, do you believe there should be changes made to Section 230 of the Telecommunications Code?
I think liability, or the lack of liability on the tech companies is troubling. I think that I understand the provision and why that was created, but what it's turned into is something it was not meant to be. And when platforms can turn a blind eye to the content, then that's troubling. And so I think we need to have regulation that requires that the tech companies are searching for and protecting children who are on these platforms. If the same things were happening in a physical world environment, then we would shut that down. There's all kinds of things that would happen. But because it's in a virtual space and because of Section 230, parents are helpless to hold anyone accountable.
Mr. Chairman, we heard the same thing months ago. Perhaps it was in this subcommittee, perhaps before the full committee, where we heard from that a vice president for Facebook was deliberately evading the law to enable illegal immigration into this country. And we continue to see this where there's these great concerns, and Mr. Gates touched on it just briefly, that our intelligence agencies are failing us here in America. Whether it's the FBI, the Department of Justice, or others, they are simply failing America in going after these problems. And I give great credit to the four folks that are before us today for making a positive impact in regards to this. But the FBI and DOJ, rather than going after Catholics in various dioceses around the country, rather than going after school board members, they should be going after these type of people. This should be a priority of theirs, and it's not. Thank you all for joining us today.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes now Ms. Dean for her 5 minutes.
I thank you, Chairman. I thank you all for your powerful testimony, and I can't stop thinking about the toll it must take on you personally to do this work, and so thank you for that. I know you convince us that the children are worth it. They're worth rescuing. So, Mr. Madsen, maybe I could start with you. Thank you for reminding us of the innocents, whether they are children who write letters to Santa Claus or await the tooth fairy, like my own grandchildren. They desperately need us, and we cannot fail. I'm pleased to co-sponsor, alongside Representative Lee, the REPORT Act. I hope it will make life better for child victims and survivors. Could you speak to the REPORT Act, what you think could be and would be effective about it for both victims and for law enforcement?
Thank you, Ms. Dean. For us, or for the ICAC community, it is the ability to send information to the National Center with urgency, with speed, over the internet. From what I'm told, that has been one of the issues that we've been dealing with over years, their ability to receive that information, also immunity related to that transaction.
How often is a child rescued? I appreciate all your focus on this, that sure, law enforcement and hunting down the criminals is important, but how often are we connecting, using these resources to rescue a child? Maybe Mr. Madsen.
So as I mentioned earlier, in an investigation where there is no file sharing or there isn't necessarily the need for the international collaboration, it happens quite often with every exploitation case that occurs at the federal all the way down to the municipal level. In terms of how often children from the list that Mr. Tebow referenced, I would turn that over to Mr. Cole.
So in the 7 years that I ran the victim identification program and laboratory at HSI, when I first started, I went into our systems in a manual way to figure out how many child victims we were rescuing annually as an agency. In the start of 2011, we rescued 262 child victims. It seems like a lot, but it's nothing. The following year, when we implemented things like Project Vic and other technology and a focus on identifying and rescuing children instead of only arresting offenders, we saw that number go up dramatically to a little over 1,000 victims in a year. Currently, we rescue anywhere between 1,000 and 1,200 victims a year just from HSI. That's globally, that's all over the world, but the vast majority of those child victims that we rescue are right here in the United States.
Thank you for that. I heard your estimate of what is needed, $500 million a year in a sustained way, not year after year deciding and tweaking and reducing and not, instead of the 32 to 34 million a year. Mr. Tebow and Ms. Cooper, what do you say? Give me the takeaway. What specifically is needed from Congress? And maybe you could blend into that, Ms. Cooper. I'm intrigued by what you said about Google. What do you want us to do? More than words, what do you want Congress to do?
So right now at C3, there are 10 victim identification specialists, right? These are the best of the best. These are like the Pro Bowlers at what they do. There's 10 for 50,000. That's what we're asking for, is to build that team. What if we had 100? Now, how successful could all the rest of the teams in ICAC be if there was people that were nonstop being able to identify these boys and girls, and then all the amazing frontline warriors were then able to once they're identified, go rescue them. If we built that team, and we were able to modernize the ICSA database so that it's not 22 years old, but it's something that is modernized so that it speeds this process up, I just think the backlog we would get to be able to get to so many kids so much faster. And I'll just tell one story to illustrate that. One of our team members was teaching at a school not long ago, and she was teaching about exploitation, and if this happens, please tell someone. And one of the second graders comes up and he says, "Where were you 2 years ago?" And that's the problem.
Thank you.
We're too late.
Ms. Cooper?
Yeah, I'm going to get really granular for you. So for FY25, what would be really helpful is if we put no less than 10 million of the amounts appropriated and direct it specifically over to the Cybercrime Center so that it doesn't get diverted to the border. That would be super helpful. We also need $6 million. You have a statement on the record from Interpol, and they're asking for $6 million. I mean, that's not much, right? So they get funded under the Department of Justice's legal services bucket of money. So if we can take $6 million in the report language and through a programmatic request and put it to the Department of Justice, but make sure you say specifically for the ICSA database, because again, we don't want it to get diverted. So those are the two things that would help us get started so we can start to build the rescue team. It's going to take us a little while to finish crafting the bill with HSI's technical assistance and obviously get that bill through Congress, but we can get it started by just putting everything that we need into the report language, and so that's what I would ask.
Thank you. Could you tell us how is that child who wrote the poem?
She's doing incredible. She's truly a hero to me, and she is not just surviving, but she is thriving.
Tell her we're touched, and we're happy. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Recognize now the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this critical hearing. And to all of our witnesses, we appreciate so much you being willing to be here today to help draw attention to this critical issue for us. The work that you do to advocate and represent the most vulnerable is so important, and we appreciate you being here. I've spent much of my career focused on this issue. As a federal prosecutor in the Middle District of Florida, I led the Child Exploitation Task Force, and now as a member of Congress, want to ensure that we are doing all of the things we need to do to support you in this important work. Ms. Cooper, I'd like to come back to you. We touched earlier on the Report Act. I'm very proud to be working on that legislation with my colleague, Representative Dean. You noted that there are, in fact, ways that we can work in a bipartisan fashion, even in an election year, and this is one of them. This issue is something that Republicans and Democrats all care about. Tell me about how the Report Act and the legislation you're developing with HSI will help you combat this problem and rescue more children.
Yeah, the Report Act is a really important bill because it helps really modernize the process of submission to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and allows them to build in some technology solutions so that they can handle the volume of images that they're receiving from the field. But it also makes it easier for law enforcement in the field to be able to transmit those images. I think right now they're mailing them in, so we're on the Pony Express over here, but we should be able to use an API in the cloud and solutions like that for NCMEC so that they can keep up with the volume. So it's a really important bill. Another important bill is the Project Safe Childhood Reauthorization Bill. So that's also a really critical bill because it prioritizes child rescue. So that's another good bill. It's in front of you. It already passed the Senate. It's bipartisan. In terms of our legislation that we want to work on, obviously we're working with you. Thank you so much for stepping forward and taking the lead on this. We're looking forward to working with you. And what we're going to do is we're going to authorize, just like we did for the Hero Child Rescue Corps, we're going to authorize a rescue team, and we're going to house it over at Homeland Security because they really are the best.
Thank you. And Mr. Tebow, I'd like to return to you, please. You mentioned Operation Renewed Hope. One of the things I think is important that we convey today is a sense of whether there's urgency to this problem. Would you share with us a little bit more about that project and why it is important that we take action now as Congress?
Well, because so many boys and girls, just like this sweet girl, are waiting, and they're suffering, and they're going through the worst days of their life, and so many people are watching it and replaying it and memorializing their worst moments, or they're going through it. This girl was going through it every single night. That's why there's urgency. But one of the things that I love so much about Operation Renewed Hope is it was so many people putting the mission above the credit. It's HSI, is Interpol, it's NCMEC, it's so many people, it's so many countries all coming together for it. And I love that because our fourth non-negotiable at our foundation is there's power when we come together. And so many reasons why we don't is because we're so worried about the credit, not the mission. But if we put the mission first, which is these boys and girls, then I believe we would come together and we could find a solution. And I think this is a really great example of so many people from all over the world putting the mission first, putting the kids first. And I love what they called it, Operation Renewed Hope. Because how many of these boys and girls right now do not have hope? They do not have any hope. You know, and I'm not just talking about the way we use hope in our society of I'm flipping a coin, I hope it lands on heads, or I'm wishing upon a star. No, I love using the biblical definition of hope, to look forward with confidence, expectation, and anticipation. How many of these boys and girls do not get to look forward with any form of confidence, expectation, or anticipation because they believe their tomorrow is going to be just as bad as today, but maybe because of all of us, because of all of you, maybe one day they'll be able to look forward with true confidence, expectation, and anticipation. That's why I love the name Operation Renewed Hope.
Well, thank you, Mr. Tebow, and your family for your commitment to this very important issue. Mr. Cole, I'd also like to direct a question to you. Earlier, I know we've had some comment about, we obviously have a very serious problem with unaccompanied children and the southern border, but would you please explain for us the distinction between HSI and Border Patrol and how that operationally is different and separate?
Yes, thank you for that a chance to clarify. So Homeland Security investigations are the special agents, the criminal investigators. We are not down at the border. We're not the folks that are handling that specific issue. That is a different agency, although under the umbrella of Department of Homeland Security. And so it is important for that distinction because HSI is really at the forefront of child exploitation crime, and we are extremely technically savvy. Our cyber crime center is outfitted with some of the best tech in the world, and our victim identification lab was outfitted with some of the best tech in the world to focus. It's just really an issue of the personnel resources. That's where we're falling short. And just to give one perspective in this kind of global issue for the United States, if you look at our counter-drug budget, just for 2023, that budget was $42.5 billion with a B. If you look at the amount of money that's spent from the federal government to combat child exploitation, it's under $200 million. Look at the disparity there. And I would argue that the two have a correlation. The victims of this horrendous crime of child exploitation, I have personally met these victims. I personally stay in touch with several of the survivors of these cases. When they're not brought out into the light, when they don't have a chance to heal, then what happens? Oftentimes, they turn to substance abuse issues to deaden the pain, to survive, to cope. Also, when you look at the issue of human trafficking, and even for child exploitation, narcotics are utilized as a mechanism to control and subvert our victims. And so there's a correlation. If we just peeled off $1 billion, I mean, what we could do with $1 billion would absolutely blow your minds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I've been very lenient with the time today. So, Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath.
Thank you very much, Chair Biggs. And to our ranking member, Sheila Jackson Lee, who's not with us today because she actually won her primary. So we're so glad to have her back again. But thank you for holding this hearing today. And, you know, I'm a mom to my core. So our children are one of the most vulnerable groups in our global community, and it is our job to do everything that we can to protect them from the evils of this world. So I want to thank every one of you on the panel today. You are truly to be commended for your passion and your willingness to serve the most vulnerable in our community, which is our children and children globally. And I do want to say, Mr. Tebow, thank you so much. I bumped into you last night, and yes, I was starstruck. But thank you so much for using your celebrity and putting it for the good of our children, to the use of protecting and serving our children. I can't think of anything that is more honorable and admirable. It is our job to do everything that we can to track down, arrest, and prosecute anyone who would want to cause them harm and exploit our children in any way. A step in the right direction is developing well-tested and well-researched identification technology and procedures to help us identify the children in CSAM. Child sexual abuse material is far too easily accessible and prevalent. We have several bills here in Congress to combat the spread of this horrible content, has been mentioned a little bit earlier, but it will take collaboration and continued dedication to save the countless children who are trafficked and exploited. We need to support law enforcement's efforts to combat the proliferation of CSAM, which is why I have introduced the End Child Exploitation Act. My bill would require the contents of reports regarding the online sexual exploitation of children provided to Cyber Tip Line be preserved by the provider for over 1 year. My bill would also assist law enforcement's investigative process by giving them more time to properly gather evidence to find the children subject to this abuse and their perpetrators. The reports will assist in the identification process and preserving records for a longer period of time, which will result in more opportunity for our law enforcement to use the valuable information they provide to identify trafficking and abuse victims and their offenders. I'm here before you today as a concerned mother who lost my own child as a victim of crime. And so I am now dedicating my entire life to protecting the safety and the well-being of all of our children. We know law enforcement and groups dedicated to the elimination of CSAM need our help and deserve the necessary resources to continue fighting for our missing and our abused children. A child should never, ever be subjected to the horrors faced by children exposed to these sick exploitation schemes. And I sit before you today proud of what our law enforcement agencies have done thus far to eliminate CSAM and bring perpetrators to justice. Thank you to each and every one of you for dedicating your time and finding these children and bringing them safely home. Mr. Madsen and Mr. Cole, my colleagues and I, we are here to make sure that law enforcement has what it needs to be successful in these tasks. But Mr. Madsen, as now a retired commander for North Florida Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, can you explain the differences between proactive and reactive investigations?
Thank you, Ms. McBath. Generally, we refer to reactive investigations as those that come through a normal channel, such as the cyber tip line, a 911, dispatch centers, any call for service that arrives on the detective's desk to follow up on. Proactive investigations are those that are self-initiated by that detective when that detective has time, such as file sharing type investigations. The numbers I referred to earlier with about 86,000 IPs that are offering CSAM material right now, that would be a proactive investigation to begin the identification process of who the user is. It would also be undercover operations where you're investigating solicitations of a minor or a parent.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to try to take liberty for a second question. Mr. Madsen, how often do Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force members conduct reactive investigations? How
Reactive
often?
would be daily, constantly, due to the influx of leads that come from the National Center and from their local jurisdictions. The proactives are the first ones to suffer.
Thank you so much. I am out of time. I appreciate you.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Fry.
Thank you, Chairman Biggs, for having us today, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. This is an incredibly important topic that spans, it is bipartisan, it is not a black or white issue or a red or blue. It is an issue that this country should lead on, and we should continue to lead on. So I appreciate the work that you do and the advocacy that to the issue here today. Look, I in South Carolina, prior to my service here, I led a bill, and South Carolina was considered to be the most improved state in the country in dealing with human trafficking. And it is amazing when you look at the county where I live, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Myrtle Beach, Horry County is in the top 3 counties of reported human trafficking. It's in rural communities, it's in urban settings, it's everywhere. 30 million people worldwide, and of course the United States is no stranger to that. Here, we've talked about a lot of these important bills. I also have one, the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act, which would allow victims of human trafficking to tell their story and to really get to the perpetrators. Law enforcement love it. Victims' rights organizations love it. It unites somebody like a conservative like me with a liberal like Ted Lieu of California. That never happens. But this issue, I think you see great bipartisan support. So it's really important to focus on this, and what you said today was really impactful, particularly the note that you received, Tim. Tim, I'm going to turn to you real quick. In your experience at the Tim Tebow Foundation, how do you all partner with law enforcement? Explain to me like the process or the mechanisms in which you work with these gentlemen.
Well, in a bunch of different ways. We believe in partnership, like I was sharing a little bit earlier. We believe there's power when we come together. We have 26 official partners, and we work with so many different forms of law enforcement in a bunch of different ways. Me and Jim are both heavily involved in intercept task forces, which there's 5 of them around the Southeast that are working on these exact crimes. We're so fortunate to be able to support C3 and HSI, Interpol, and so many different groups working together. So for us, it's more about a calling. When we feel called into it, we want to step in and find any way that we possibly can help.
You know, and I would echo Ms. Macbeth's comment earlier about using your celebrity for good, and it's really important. I'm glad that you're doing that. What is the most crucial message to you that you would like to share to people across the country about preventing and identifying this material?
I think it's hard to say what's one message. But what I would say is that every single person has a chance to make an impact. Every single one of us can make a difference. You know, every one of us has different gifts, different abilities, different platforms, different backgrounds, different opportunities to use it. You know, some are gifted in long-term restoration for people that are brought out of trafficking or exploitation to love on them really well. Some are trauma counselors, some are on the front lines like these amazing men, but we all have something to give, something to offer, and when we bring it and put it all on the table, I think special things would happen.
Thank you for that. Ms. Cooper, I want to turn to you briefly. You talked earlier about steps, right? Things that we can do better. You mentioned a watermark on pictures, certainly funding, you talked about that. What are some other specific steps, or what are some pitfalls in our current legal structure that you think this Congress needs to address?
You know, I think the most important thing is to talk about two things. One, you know, children are disclosing sex abuse, and they're not being believed. They're being put into a court system that just brutalizes them and doesn't believe them, gaslights them, sometimes puts them right back into the custody of their abuser. So we have to fix CAPTA. We have a diversion program for child rapists under CAPTA, and that needs to be fixed. We have to prevent that from continuing. So believing children, supporting children, and amending CAPTA. But we can't just rely on children's outcries, because most of the time they're intimidated, they're threatened, told not to tell, and some of them are subject to some really intense violence. Some of these images are really sadistic. So, the more that we can work on the child rescue side of this, the more children we can get to, and we don't have to wait for them to cry out. So we really need to do those two things together at the same time.
Are there any areas where NGOs can maybe more effectively contribute to the collaboration between NGOs and government offices?
Yeah, we see a lot of it. So, we're really fortunate to have some incredible partners like IJM and Operation Lightshine and HSI and Interpol and the Canadian Center for Child Protection. And so the one advantage to being able to partner with private NGOs is that we can move fast, we can flex, we can pivot, and we can meet the demands and the challenges as they come in. Government moves very slow. It's very bureaucratic. So there's an advantage to working, but we can't make arrests. We don't have arrest authority. You don't want to be putting CSAM in the hands of NGOs, right? So we don't want them to be doing the law enforcement part, but we can do the part where we can pivot, we can build technology, we can move quickly, and we can supplement them where they need it.
Thank you. This time has expired.
Fair.
Fair?
Can I add on to that if it's okay?
Yeah, yes. Well, what the heck?
Lost control of this one.
Yeah.
Another way
I got the gavel here. I'm not sure what it's for. Yeah, Mr. Tebow, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to respond to
Thanks
Mr.
for your
Foster's.
grace.
Yeah.
I think another thing that's so important is when a boy or girl is brought out of trafficking or exploitation, to be able to have such a clean handoff so that their first moments of freedom are also with people that are loving them or caring for them, trauma-informed counselors, so they're not just going to a location and sitting by themselves for a while, but they're being loved, they're being cared for, and that healing starts instantly. That's also a really important handoff.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the entire committee, Mr. Jordan from Ohio.
I thank the chairman, and I thank our witnesses for this important hearing. It's the kind of subject that we need to address, and I appreciate the committee doing so. I would yield to the chairman of the subcommittee for further questions, and would yield back.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So let's talk a little bit about the interface between the Tebow Foundation and and law enforcement and make sure that we understand. I want the granular level because it's my understanding that when a victim is found and rescued, that the federal government is not providing or doesn't. There's not a mechanism in place necessarily to provide resources that you guys provide, housing, trauma counseling, et cetera. So would you elaborate on that, please, Mr. Tebow?
Yeah, it totally depends on the area, the country, the location. But yes, that is one of the things that we do our best to provide. We're fortunate with our team of partners to have 42 safe homes and 9 more in progress right now where we're trying to care for boys and girls that have been abused, trafficked, or exploited. And that is something we're extremely passionate about. And it's also so important that handoff where we can work side by side with law enforcement in doing that so that there is an efficient handoff in that moment.
So you liaison with the law enforcement, they liaison with you, and they say, we have a child that we were going to rescue, and you guys are then able to step in and help out. Is that right?
Yes, sir. With different law enforcement and different opportunities, not all the time, but if we have that opportunity to do so, then yes, sir.
Thanks. Ms. Cooper, I want to ask you a question about CAPTA. So you said something that was intriguing. I know that in Arizona, for instance, that's where I'm from. So, if a child has been abused, not virtually, but certainly, that we find in real time, that child is taken from the parents. The child is actually charged with a felony and is not reunited with the parents. At least that's the normal plan. At least when I was representing children. So, my question for you is, what is the distinction between the federal law CAPTA and the state law that is providing essentially a hole in the law that is reuniting a victim with the abuser?
Yeah, we have states' rights, right? So we have sort of a patchwork of state laws, and sometimes the states do it differently. They might pass a bill that allows them to have some nuance, but under CAPTA, under the Social Security Act, I think it's Section 629B. The states are required, if they receive CAPTA funding, to come up with what's called a state plan. And under that state plan, it requires reunification. So even if a child is raped in their own home, raped by their father, the father's removed and goes to prison, that's the best case scenario. When he gets out, he's allowed to petition the court to have custody of that child again. And if you can imagine being raped by someone and then being forced to have to go back and spend time with them, what that does to that child, right? So that is a loophole under CAPTA.
Thank you, and of course we'll have to look at that. I've added that now to my action items following this hearing. Wanted to talk again about, and maybe I don't know which one of you wants to address this one, but I know that the Tebow Foundation helped bring together international organizations like Interpol, Europol, with HSI and others to try to internationalize this. So tell us a little bit about that, how that works, and how the international, what resources are being used by Interpol, by Europol.
Well, with specifically Operation Renewed Hope, a lot of the victim identification specialists aren't allowed and don't have the budgets to be able to fly here and work on Operation Renewed Hope. And so we're able to help bring all of those victim ID experts in so that they can work side by side, because if not, they wouldn't be able to have that collaboration team approach. So that's, with Operation Renewed Hope, that's a big area where we come into play, is bringing those victim ID specialists right here to C3 so that they can work together.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that. I'm going to go now to Mr. Cole. I had a chance to go to the facility in Fairfax, and it's an incredible facility. And tell me about AI. I mean, I saw some demonstrations of AI and how some cases were resolved using AI. Please tell us how it's being used positively to resolve cases.
Yeah, so artificial intelligence is incredibly important, and it's a broad term, as you're aware, but it's incredibly important to the fight against child sexual exploitation, because we are buried in an ocean of data, and both textual, visual, et cetera.
I'm going to stop you right there real quick. Mr. Jordan, your 5 minutes has expired. Thank you. And now I recognize myself for my 5 minutes, and please continue with your answer.
So we're buried in this ocean of data that is just impossible for human beings manually to go through to find the relationships, to find the victims, to find the offenders. The goal of the Victim Identification Lab at C3, our mission statement, is to conduct advanced analytics on multimedia files of child sexual exploitation material to identify and rescue the child or children, identify and apprehend the offender or offenders, and identify and locate the crime scene. And it is a daunting task. There's so much that goes into that. There's in-depth data that surrounds all this material. So artificial intelligence is incredibly important, but it's also important to use it ethically. It's also important that we stay within the left and the right guide limits that we've established and have accountability for that to use I am afraid of entities or governments that have outright banned the use of certain AI. I understand the concerns behind it, but I think it's misguided in that, we're using AI and it is rescuing children. And without that AI, children would go unrescued without a doubt. And we've seen it. Operation Renewed Hope is a wonderful example of that. And so it's important that that capability is maintained, but it's also important that we establish those left and right limits so it's used appropriately.
So I want to ask you just real quickly about this. How do you train? You don't even need to be specific about how you train. Let's talk about the number of people that you are able to train and the necessity at HSI that you think the numbers need to be for the victim identification team.
Yeah, so, Tim talked about having 10 people at the Victim ID Lab currently. Well, that's actually 10 positions, only 7 are filled. So there's really only 7 people that are currently working victim identification. And again, trying to solve day to day the new cases that are coming in the 50,000.
And they can't last very long. I mean, this is a 3 to 5 year position, I would guess.
I did it my whole 20 years. I think everybody's different, and I think it's important to have, again, mental welfare safeguards as well. Sure. We've improved upon that dramatically, but it's important to scale that as we scale the personnel that would be working this. But, with only 10 positions at HSI conducting victim identification, we have 250 field offices around the country, right? They're in your districts. They're in your hometowns. They're out there of HSI agents. But they're working the cases alongside the ICACs, very much like the ICACs are. So they're mostly reactive. They don't have the time to conduct victim identification, nor oftentimes the training and the resources. The training, we would run a 2-week victim identification training course that I helped develop back in my time there. That's it's an intense 2 weeks, but you can only get so many people into those courses, and they're expensive to run because of the equipment we have to issue those folks and software.
Thank you. And Mr. Mattson, I met with some of your colleagues today, and there's been authorization, for instance, for $60 million for the ICACs, if I'm not mistaken, and that's been pretty consistent, but the highest you guys have ever actually seen appropriated is $34 million, if I remember that right. And how I was presented with some numbers which were different than your $500 million. I think the $500 million sounds like an ideal, but what can we do more short-term to just put some pedal to the metal on this?
So obviously, for me, having dealt with budgets year over year through the DOJ program, the ICAC, having sustainable funding is the gold standard. Certainly, there could be earmarked funding to support one or more task forces briefly, but for them to really be able to benefit from that over time, to train people, as Jim mentioned, training somebody to do enhanced victim identification, like the stuff that he's talking about at C3 or at Interpol, it takes time. Getting somebody out of the office for 2 weeks, it's very, very difficult, generally. I think what we've asked for is numbers that are closer between the $120 and $160 million mark, and certainly hoping that we can get to that in the short term. But as you mentioned, the ideal number is much higher, and we fully understand that's an unlikely thing to achieve today.
Thanks for that. And so I just want to summarize real quickly. I appreciate, again, all the witnesses for being here and the members who are here to ask questions. I just want to, I'm looking here at my scrawled notes here that on action items, and I want to just go over those. And if I miss any, please catch me afterwards and tell me what else that you felt that we need to do. Number one is we're talking about making a potential markup of the Report Act so that we can make it go forward if possible. And I would say we want to make sure it's as clean and as close to perfect as possible. Second thing is to authorize with the requisite appropriations resources necessary to for the ID victims units and also to make sure we rescue and prosecute these perpetrators. Apparently, we also have some holes with the victims after they've been rescued, so we want to see if we can find that out. Number three would be to continue to highlight CSAM awareness to policymakers, influencers, and to the public. And then my own is I want to meet with Google to find out when the heck they're doing that seems to be right and see how we can make that a little bigger. And with that, I will just say that I have some documents to include. One is Interpol's Crimes Against Children Unit. I'd like to submit that for the record. And also a document called Childlike Global Child Safety Institute Report on child sexual exploitation and abuse victim identification. And so without objection, those will be admitted into the record. And with that, again, I thank everyone for being here today. And with that, the committee is adjourned.